You walked into a room and forgot why you went in there. Maybe it happened this morning. Maybe it happened yesterday. Maybe it's been happening often enough that you've started to notice it, not just as a passing inconvenience, but as something that makes you pause for a second longer than you used to. You stand in the doorway, reach for the reason you came in, and find nothing there. Just a blank where something should be. Most people laugh it off. I'm just tired. I've got too much on my mind. This always happens to me. And then they move on and forget that they forgot, and that's the end of it. But some people don't quite let it go. Some people have a small, quiet moment of unease that they don't say out loud, a thought that passes quickly but leaves something behind. And if you're watching this right now, I suspect you might be one of those people. I'm not here to alarm you. I want to be clear about that from the very beginning. What I'm going to share with you today isn't about illness or crisis. It's about something more subtle and more important than that. The daily habits that either protect your memory and sharpen it over time, or slowly, quietly erode it. Habits so ordinary that most people never question them. I've spent a long time working with patients, long enough to recognize patterns that don't always show up in textbooks, long enough to notice that the people who arrive in my office, struggling with memory, with focus, with that feeling of mental fog that they can't quite name, they often share something in common. Not a diagnosis, not a specific condition, a way of living, a set of small daily habits that, or taken individually, seem completely harmless, and taken together over months and years, begin to chip away at something they thought was simply part of getting older. It isn't always part of getting older. That's what I want to talk about today. Let me start by saying something that I think most people don't fully believe, even when they've heard it before. Memory is not a fixed thing. It isn't something you're simply born with a certain amount of, like the color of your eyes, that slowly diminishes as years pass, and there's nothing to be done about it. That's not how memory works. Memory is dynamic. It is shaped continuously, actively, daily, by the choices you make and the habits you maintain. The brain is remarkably responsive to the life it lives inside. And the research on this has been consistent enough and clear enough that I feel confident saying it to you the way I would say it to a patient sitting across from me. What you do every day matters more than you probably realize. The difficult part is that the habits that affect memory the most are often the ones that feel the most harmless. They don't feel like they're doing anything. They don't hurt. They don't announce themselves as problems. They just quietly become your routine. And your routine becomes your brain's environment, and your brain responds to that environment in ways that take years to become visible. By the time someone sits down in my office and says, "I've been having trouble remembering things lately," the habits that contributed to that have usually been in place for a long time. Not always, but often. And what I've found, over and over again, is that when people make even small adjustments to those habits, consistently over time, things change. Not overnight, not dramatically, but measurably, genuinely. That's what I want to walk you through today. 5 habits, not extreme interventions, not lifestyle overhauls. 5 ordinary daily things that have more influence over your memory than most people would ever guess. The first one is something I think about every time I see a patient who tells me their mind feels slower than it used to. Slower to find words, slower to recall details, slower to connect ideas. And when I ask them about their days, what they actually do, hour by hour, there's a pattern I've come to recognize immediately. They're busy, genuinely productively busy. They're answering emails, responding to messages, managing schedules, and watching content, consuming information constantly. Their brains are active all day long in a very specific way. They're processing, reacting, responding. But very rarely are they doing something different, something that requires the brain to work in an unfamiliar direction, something that demands real mental effort in a new or challenging way. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else I could tell you about memory. The brain has a remarkable capacity to adapt to challenge. When you ask it to do something difficult, something it hasn't quite done before, or something that requires sustained concentration and active problem-solving, it responds by strengthening the neural connections involved in that activity. It builds, in a very literal sense. New pathways form. Existing ones are reinforced. The brain becomes, at a structural level, more capable. But when the brain is never genuinely challenged, when every demand placed on it is familiar, routine, easily managed, those same mechanisms that would normally strengthen it go quiet. The brain adapts to ease the same way it adapts to challenge. It becomes efficient at doing exactly what it's already doing, and less equipped for anything beyond that. What I'm describing is mental stimulation, not in the abstract, motivational sense, in the practical, daily sense. I had a patient, a man in his late 50s, sharp and articulate, successful in his career, who came to me concerned about what he called a narrowing of his mind. Less flexible, less creative. Trouble finding words in conversation. He'd been doing the same work, in the same way, for 20 years. Excellent at it. But he'd stopped, was somewhere along the way, learning anything genuinely new. We talked about what it would mean to challenge his brain again. Not a brain training app? Those tend to make you better at the app and not much else. I mean real, effortful engagement with something unfamiliar. A language, an instrument. Reading in a field that didn't come easily, sitting with uncertainty before the answer became clear. It took months. But over time, he described something shifting. A feeling of greater fluency, in thought, in speech, in holding multiple ideas at once. He called it a kind of mental loosening. Something that had stiffened had begun to move again. And what I've seen, consistently, is that brains that are regularly asked to do hard, unfamiliar things stay sharper longer than brains that are not. Or most people think they're giving their brain a workout when they're scrolling through content, moving quickly between topics, absorbing a constant stream of new information. But that kind of stimulation is shallow. It doesn't require sustained focus. It doesn't produce struggle, and it's the struggle, the effortful reaching for something just beyond comfortable grasp, that seems to produce growth. Ask your brain to work, not occasionally, regularly, in ways that are genuinely uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's the sign that you're doing it right. The second habit I want to talk about is one that people consistently undervalue, and I find that remarkable given how much we all know, intellectually, that it matters. Sleep. I'm going to say something that I've said to more patients than I can count, and I want you to hear it the same way I mean it when I say it in person. Sleep is not rest. Sleep is not simply the absence of activity. Sleep is the most neurologically active period of the day, and what happens during it, what the brain does while you're lying still with your eyes closed, is absolutely critical to your ability to form, consolidate, and retrieve memories. There's a process that happens during sleep, particularly during the deeper stages of it, where the brain actively transfers information from short-term to long-term storage. Things you learned, experienced, or encountered during the day are processed, sorted, reinforced, and filed during sleep. This isn't a passive process. It requires time, and it requires the specific conditions that sleep creates. Without adequate sleep, that process is interrupted. Memories that should have been consolidated are partially lost, Details that should have been retained become fuzzy. Connections that should have formed don't fully form. And here's the part that most people don't think about. The effects of poor sleep on memory are cumulative. A single bad night produces a noticeable but temporary effect. Weeks and months of insufficient or fragmented sleep produce something more persistent, a gradual reduction in the brain's ability to encode new information, retrieve existing information, and maintain the kind of focused attention that good memory requires. I've sat across from people in their 40s and 50s who were genuinely convinced they were experiencing early cognitive decline, worried about it, frightened by it in some cases. And when we went through everything carefully, everything about their lives, their routines, their patterns, it became clear that they were sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night and had been doing so for years, treating sleep as something to be minimized, something to get through quickly so they could be productive again. When they changed that, when they took sleep seriously enough to prioritize it, to protect it, to make the conditions for it actually good, things shifted. Not for everyone equally, and not without time. But for many of them, what they had assumed was an inevitable decline was, at least in significant part, the accumulated effect of years of insufficient sleep. I want to say one more thing about sleep that often gets lost in these conversations. Quality matters as much as duration. You can spend 8 hours in bed and still sleep poorly if your sleep is frequently interrupted, or if your schedule is wildly inconsistent night to night. The brain's memory consolidation processes require sustained, uninterrupted periods of deep sleep. Fragmented sleep, even when the total hours look adequate on paper, interrupts those processes in ways that accumulate. If you want to protect your memory, sleep is not the luxury you've been treating it as. It is the foundation that everything else rests on. The third habit is one that I think will be the most uncomfortable for people to hear. Not because it's complicated, because it requires admitting something about how we live now that most of us would prefer not to admit. We are profoundly, chronically distracted. And we have become so accustomed to that distraction that we've stopped recognizing it as a problem. I'm talking about the phone on the desk while you're trying to work, the notification that pulls your attention sideways just as you've settled into something. The habit of switching between tasks, emails and conversations and videos and messages in an endless cycle that feels like productivity but is, from a neurological standpoint, something quite different. The brain has a limited capacity for attention. Not unlimited, not expandable on demand. Limited. And focused, sustained attention is one of the primary requirements for strong memory encoding. For a memory to form properly, the brain needs to be fully present with the experience or information it's processing. It needs to allocate sufficient attentional resources. When attention is fragmented, when it's constantly pulled elsewhere, constantly switching between inputs, that encoding process is compromised. Things are processed at the surface level rather than being integrated deeply. And surface-level processing produces surface-level retention, which is to say, poor memory. What research on attention and multitasking has shown consistently is that the human brain doesn't actually do multiple things simultaneously. It switches between them, rapidly, at a cost. Each switch requires a small period of reorientation. The brain has to close down one process and open another, and then close that, and return to the first. This switching has a metabolic cost, a time cost, and most relevantly, here, a memory cost. And the information you were processing when the interruption came is less likely to be retained than it would have been had the interruption not occurred. I notice this in patients who describe memory problems, and when I ask them to walk me through a typical day, What they describe is near continuous interruption. Almost no period of sustained focus longer than a few minutes. The phone always within reach, every notification addressed immediately, every passing thought acted on. And they wonder why, at the end of the day, they can't clearly recall what they were doing that morning. The habit I'm describing here is not about eliminating technology or becoming a monk. It's about protecting periods of genuine, uninterrupted attention. It's about choosing, deliberately, to be fully present with one thing at a time. To close the other tabs. To silence the notifications. To stay with a single task or conversation or piece of information long enough for the brain to actually process it to depth. This is harder than it sounds. Much harder for most people than they expect it to be. We have trained ourselves to constant stimulation, and genuine sustained focus can feel uncomfortable at first, almost restless, like something is missing. That feeling is the withdrawal symptom of a brain that has adapted to perpetual distraction. But the improvement in memory and mental clarity that comes from reclaiming your attention, from giving your brain the conditions it needs to actually encode what it encounters, is something I've seen described by patients repeatedly. Not after weeks, sometimes after just days of being more deliberate about this. Protect your attention. Treat it as something finite and precious, because it is. The memories you form are only as strong as the attention you gave the moment in which they were formed. The fourth habit is one that surprises people when I bring it up, because it sounds almost too simple, almost too ordinary to matter. But I've thought about it a great deal, and I've seen the evidence for it in practice, and I think it matters more than its simplicity suggests. Small, deliberate changes in routine. I know, it sounds counterintuitive. We're told that routine is good, that consistency is healthy, that predictability reduces stress, and stress reduction is good for the brain. And there's truth in all of that. I'm not saying abandon your structure. I'm saying something more specific. The brain's memory systems, particularly the systems involved in forming and retaining new memories, are activated by novelty, by something unexpected, by a break in the pattern that requires the brain to pay attention in a slightly different way than it ordinarily would. When everything is completely predictable, completely routine, the brain doesn't need to actively encode what's happening, because it already knows what's going to happen next. It goes on a kind of autopilot. And autopilot is efficient, but it produces very thin memory traces. Very little is retained about an experience that was indistinguishable from every other experience. You've probably noticed this yourself without quite framing it this way. Think about a week from your life 2 years ago. A completely typical week. Nothing unusual happening. You likely can't reconstruct much of it. Now think about a week from the same period when something different happened. When you traveled somewhere new, or had an unexpected conversation, or tried something for the first time. That week is more accessible. More detail has been retained. Not because you tried harder to remember it, but because the novelty of the experience prompted the brain to pay attention differently and encode it more deeply. The habit I'm describing is about introducing small doses of that novelty deliberately, regularly, not by overhauling your life, but by making minor changes that require your brain to be present and attentive rather than on autopilot, taking a different route to somewhere you go every day, eating somewhere unfamiliar, having a conversation with someone outside your usual circle. It's learning to do something you normally do with one hand using the other hand. Tiny disruptions to the ordinary that send the brain a signal. Pay attention. Something new is happening. I had a patient who described her daily life as feeling, in her words, blurred. She felt like she was moving through days without really being in them, and her memory of those days was correspondingly vague. She began making very small changes, deliberately small, because she was skeptical anything so minor could matter. A different morning walk, a new recipe once a week, a book in a genre she'd never touched. She reported, after a few months, that her sense of being present had changed, that her memory felt more textured, less blurred. The brain is stimulated by what it hasn't seen before. Give it something new to look at, regularly, even in small ways. It doesn't require grand gestures. It requires intention. The fifth habit is the one that I suspect will be the most difficult for people to accept in a culture that has elevated constant productivity to something close to a virtue. Mental rest. Genuine, deliberate, unstructured mental rest. Not sleep. I've already talked about sleep, and sleep is in its own category. I'm talking about something different. Moments during the waking day when you are not consuming, not producing, not engaged with a screen or a task or a conversation. Moments when you simply allow your mind to be quiet, to wander, to do what it does when you leave it alone. There's a network in the brain sometimes called the default mode network. It's active when the brain is not focused on a specific external task. When you're daydreaming, when you're taking a walk without a podcast in your ears, when you sit somewhere quiet without immediately reaching for your phone, for a long time, this network was considered a kind of neural idle state. The brain in standby, doing nothing important. What research has shown in the years since is that this view was quite wrong. The default mode network is extraordinarily active during rest. And among the things it does during that activity is memory processing, consolidating and organizing information, making connections between things learned at different times, integrating new information with existing knowledge. In other words, some of what we think of as memory consolidation doesn't only happen during sleep, it also happens during wakeful rest. During the unstructured moments when we stop demanding something from our brains and let them work on their own terms. And those moments, for many people today, have been almost entirely eliminated. Every gap in the day is filled. The commute has a podcast. The lunch break has a phone. The 5 minutes of waiting has a scroll. The quiet that used to exist naturally in daily life, the unscheduled, unoptimized time that the brain used to have for itself, has been replaced, systematically, with content, with stimulation, with input that never stops. I think this is one of the least discussed contributors to the kind of memory and cognitive complaints I hear most commonly. Not any single dramatic cause. Just the steady elimination of the quiet time that the brain needs to do its own work. What I've begun recommending to patients, and what I've seen make a genuine difference, is very simple. Not meditation, not a practice that requires training or time or equipment. Just moments. Deliberate, protected, unscheduled moments each day when nothing is demanded of the mind. A walk without headphones. 10 minutes of sitting somewhere comfortable without a task. The kind of boredom, almost, that used to be unavoidable and has now become rare. Let the mind drift. Don't direct it. Don't fill the silence. One patient described it to me as uncomfortable at first. The urge to reach for the phone was almost physical, she said. But she committed to a short period each day of simply being quiet, unoccupied. After a few weeks, she told me something I found striking. She said she'd started having ideas again, thoughts that connected things she hadn't consciously been thinking about, memories surfacing from nowhere, fully formed and detailed. She said her mind felt less congested. That's the word she used. Congested. And I've thought about that word many times since, because I think it's accurate. A brain that is never allowed to be quiet accumulates a kind of mental congestion, an overload of unprocessed input with nowhere to go. The rest is how it clears. And when you don't give it the rest, the processing backs up, the clarity suffers, and eventually what you notice is that your memory doesn't work the way it used to. Give your brain the silence it needs, not as a luxury, as a requirement. None of what I've described today requires purchasing anything. None of it requires a specialist or a prescription or a dramatic change in who you are. What it requires is something simultaneously simple and genuinely difficult. Attention. Your own attention, turned toward your own habits, honestly enough to see what's actually there. Most people, when they examine their daily habits honestly, find at least 2 or 3 of the things I've described. The sleep that isn't quite restful. The distraction that's become invisible because it's so constant. The days that blur together because nothing ever changes. The quiet that was crowded out long ago. The mental challenges that stopped happening somewhere along the way. These things accumulate. Over time, these small things add up in ways that are real and measurable, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. In the same way that water shapes stone, not through any single moment, but through consistency. And they can be changed with the same consistency. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve reassurance. Memory changes with age. Some degree of change is normal and expected. I'm not going to promise you that these 5 habits will reverse the clock or protect you from every cognitive challenge that life may bring. Medicine can't promise that, and I won't make claims that medicine can't support. What I can tell you, based on what I've seen and what the research consistently shows, is that the condition of your brain at any age is influenced, meaningfully, measurably, by how you treat it every day. That the gap between the brain that is stimulated and the brain that isn't. The brain that sleeps and the brain that doesn't. The brain that is given focus and the brain that is given only fragmentation. That gap grows larger over time than most people anticipate. You have more influence over this than you've probably been led to believe. As I finish today, I want to leave you with something simple. Not a program to follow. Not a plan to implement. Just a question to sit with. When you think about the habits I've described, the mental stimulation, the sleep, the attention you give each moment, the small novelties you allow into your days, the quiet you protect or don't protect, which of them feels most familiar? Which of them, if you're honest with yourself, is the one you've been neglecting longest? That's where I'd start. Not with all 5 at once. Not with a resolution that covers everything. But with one thing, chosen honestly, changed consistently. The brain responds to what you do every day, not to what you intend to do, or what you know you should do, what you actually do, consistently, over time. Your memory is not something that simply happens to you. It is, in significant part, something you participate in building or allowing to weaken through the ordinary choices of ordinary days. I hope something today was useful to you. I hope it prompted a thought that stays with you. And I hope it leads you toward a conversation, with your own doctor, with someone who knows your full health picture, if anything I've said raised a question you think deserves a real answer. One final thing. Everything I've shared today is meant for educational purposes. It reflects my experience and the research I find credible, but it is not medical advice, and it is not a substitute for the evaluation of a physician who knows you personally. If you have genuine concerns about your memory or cognitive health, please see a doctor. Not because what you're experiencing is necessarily something serious. It may not be at all. But because a real conversation with a real clinician who can look at the whole picture of who you are is always going to be more valuable than anything a video can offer. Take care of your brain. It is, in the most